Stop scrolling. What I am about to tell you has gotten 3 people killed in the past 6 months. 10 small Alaskan towns. 10 nightmares that locals refuse to discuss. And one pattern that connects them all. A pattern that suggests something is systematically claiming these communities, one person at a time. Here is what terrifies me most. At the end of this video, I'll reveal the one warning sign that appears in all 10 stories. A sign that, if you recognize it, means you have exactly 72 hours to leave. 3 people ignored this warning. 3 families are now planning funerals. Before we descend into the Alaskan darkness, subscribe to Midnight Whispers Stories now. Next week's episode covers the sealed government documents about what is really happening in Alaska, its remote villages. Subscribers get early access. Smash that bell icon. We upload weekly, and what is coming will change how you see small-town America forever. Drop a comment immediately. Tell me, where are you watching from? What time is it? And have you ever been to a small Alaskan town? Viewers who watch between 2 to 4 a.m. report hearing something following them after these stories. Your comment might save someone's life. There is a hidden phrase in story number 5 that every Alaskan knows but will never say out loud. Find it. Comment the timestamp. Less than 1% notice it. Now, let me tell you about the caves beneath Ketchikan, where something ancient is calling people home. Story 1. Echoes beneath Ketchikan. I still hear the chanting when the wind picks up at night, and I live 3,000 miles away now. Let me tell you about the most terrifying mistake I ever made. It started with a job posting that seemed too good to be true, because it was. A wildlife photography contract in Ketchikan, Alaska, documenting eagles and whales for a nature magazine. Good money, isolated beauty, and a chance to escape my crumbling marriage back in Seattle. I took it without asking enough questions. The town sits on the edge of the world, clinging to steep hills above gray water. Fog rolls in thick and constant, smothering everything in white silence. The locals kept to themselves, offering polite smiles that never reached their eyes. Something felt wrong from the moment I stepped off the ferry, but I told myself it was just small-town awkwardness, that haunted feeling you get in unfamiliar places. My cabin rental sat on the outskirts, perched above a rocky beach. The property manager, an older woman with silver hair and weathered skin, handed me the keys with a strange warning. She told me to stay away from the southern caves when the tide came in. She said the rocks were dangerous, unstable, prone to collapse. Her eyes told a different story. They held fear, the real kind, the shadow of something she refused to name. I should have listened. The first week passed normally enough. I captured stunning shots of bald eagles diving for salmon, documented a pod of orcas hunting in the channel. The work absorbed me during daylight hours. But at night, lying in that creaky cabin with fog pressing against the windows, I heard sounds drifting up from the beach. Low, rhythmic sounds that might have been waves but felt like voices. Chilling whispers that made my skin crawl. On the 8th night, I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down to investigate. The moon hung fat and orange behind the mist, casting everything in a disturbing amber glow. The beach stretched empty in both directions, just wet stones and driftwood skeletons. But those sounds continued, clearer now. Definitely not water against rock. They came from the south, from the direction of the forbidden caves. Curiosity is a dangerous thing. It overrides common sense, drowns out warning bells. I told myself I was being rational, that I needed to identify the source of the noise for my own peace of mind. The truth is, something pulled me forward, something dark and magnetic. The southern coastline grew rougher, jagged formations of black rock jutting from the surf like broken teeth. The fog thickened until my flashlight beam barely penetrated 10 feet ahead. And then I saw it, a cave mouth, massive and dripping, exhaling cold air that smelled of salt and something else. Something rotten and ancient. The sounds came from inside. Not just sounds anymore, but clear human voices, multiple voices, rising and falling in unison. Chanting. The words made no sense, guttural syllables in no language I recognized. Yet they vibrated in my chest, resonated in my bones. Every instinct screamed to run, but my feet carried me closer. The horror of that moment, the way my own body betrayed me, still makes my hands shake. I stepped into the cave. The darkness swallowed me immediately, my flashlight revealing wet stone walls covered in strange symbols. Not modern graffiti, but carved deep, worn smooth by centuries of touch. The markings spiraled downward, leading deeper into the earth. The chanting grew louder, echoing up from below, and with it came a smell that made me gag. Decay, burning herbs, human sweat and fear. The tunnel descended steeply. I should have turned back 100 times. But that pull, that terrifying compulsion, drove me forward. My beam caught glimpses of more carvings, increasingly disturbing images of figures with too many limbs, faces twisted in ecstasy or agony. Impossible to tell which. The air grew warmer despite the depth, thick and humid, pressing against my face like invisible hands. Then the tunnel opened into a chamber, and I saw them. 20 or 30 people stood in a circle around a natural pit in the cave floor. They wore ordinary clothes, jeans and flannel and rain jackets, looking like they could be anyone from town. But their eyes rolled back white in their skulls, mouths moving in perfect synchronization, producing that horrifying chant. Candles ringed the pit, their flames dancing without any breeze, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering so hard I thought they must hear it. But they remained lost in their ritual, swaying together, arms raised toward the ceiling. In the center of their circle, I could finally see into the pit. And what I saw there broke something fundamental in my understanding of reality. The pit went down impossibly far, deeper than should exist beneath a coastal cave. And it moved. The darkness inside writhed and pulsed, a living shadow that breathed in rhythm with the chanting. Shapes formed and dissolved in that black, terrible suggestions of forms that hurt to perceive. Eyes that weren't eyes, mouths that opened onto nothing. One of the chanters, a young woman I recognized from the grocery store, began to descend into the pit. The others, voices rose higher, more frantic, as she climbed down crude handholds carved into the stone. She smiled the entire time, serene and empty, walking willingly into that nightmare. The darkness reached up for her, and when it touched her skin, she didn't scream. She sighed, like coming home. That broke my paralysis. I ran. I scrambled back through that tunnel, scraping skin from my palms on the rough walls, my flashlight beam jerking wildly. Behind me, the chanting changed. They knew I was there. They knew someone had witnessed their secret. I burst from the cave mouth into the fog, gasping and sobbing. The tide had come in during my exploration, cutting off the beach route back to my cabin. I had to climb the rocky hillside, tearing my clothes, bruising my ribs. Every second I expected hands to grab me from behind, to drag me back into that darkness. The fear tasted metallic in my mouth. When I finally reached my cabin, I locked every door and window, shoved furniture against the entrances. I called the police, tried to explain what I had seen. The dispatcher listened in silence, then said help was on the way. But no one came. Hours passed. Dawn broke gray and cheerless. The property manager arrived instead, along with two men I had never seen before. They stood outside my door, not knocking, just waiting. The manager spoke through the wood, her voice gentle and sad. She told me I had made a terrible mistake. She said the old ones beneath Ketchikan had been sleeping for so long, but now they were stirring. My presence in the cave, my witnessing of the ritual, had opened something that should have stayed closed. She said I could join them, that it would be easier, peaceful even, to surrender to the pull I must be feeling. And she was right. Part of me wanted to unlock that door, to walk back down to those caves, to understand what lived in that pit. The compulsion burned in my veins like fever. Instead, I smashed my bedroom window and ran. I ran through yards, through the misty streets, to the ferry terminal. I paid triple for a ticket on the next boat out, left everything behind except my wallet and phone. The entire ride back to the mainland, I watched the shoreline, expecting to see figures emerging from the fog, following. That was 4 months ago. I am back in Seattle now, back to my ordinary life. But I am not the same. The pull remains, a constant whisper at the edge of my thoughts. On clear nights, I can hear the ocean even though I live miles inland, and beneath the waves, I hear that chanting, calling me back, promising revelation. I researched Ketchikan obsessively. The town has always had a high rate of disappearances, going back centuries. The Tlingit people who originally inhabited the area had stories about caves that connected to other realms, about things that swam up from the deep places of the earth. They abandoned certain territories, considered them cursed ground. I found old newspaper articles about a cult in the 1930s, a group that performed disturbing rituals in coastal caves before they all vanished during a single night. The caves were sealed. Official reports say they collapsed, but local legends tell a different story. They say the cult succeeded, that they opened a door and walked through, and the door never fully closed again. Every week, I receive letters with no return address. They contain photographs of me, taken recently, going about my daily routine. Shopping for groceries, walking my dog, sitting alone in my apartment, and written on the back of each photo, in different handwriting every time, the same message: come home. The old ones are waiting. Your place in the circle is prepared. I changed my locks, changed my phone number, filed police reports that go nowhere. Because how do you explain this? How do you make anyone believe in something so horrifying and impossible? Last night, I woke to find myself standing on my balcony in the rain, facing north, arms raised toward Alaska. I have no memory of getting out of bed, of unlocking the sliding door. My mouth was moving, shaping words I did not choose, in that same guttural language I heard in the cave. When I snapped back to awareness, my throat was raw from chanting. I am writing this down now as a warning and a confession. If you are reading this, if something has happened to me, you need to know the truth. There are places in this world where the boundaries grow thin, where ancient things still sleep and dream. Ketchikan sits on one such place. The caves beneath that town connect to something older than humanity, something that hungers and waits and pulls at susceptible minds. Do not go looking for those caves. Do not listen if you hear chanting in the fog. And if you ever find yourself in a small Alaska town where the locals smile without warmth and warn you away from certain places, listen to them. Some doors should never be opened. Some shadows should never be given form. Because once you have seen what lives beneath, once you have felt its attention turned toward you, you become marked, connected, and eventually, no matter how far you run or how hard you resist, it calls you home. I can feel it now, stronger than ever. The pull, the certainty that I need to go back, need to complete what I started by witnessing their ritual. Part of me knows this is wrong, knows I am being manipulated by something inhuman. But another part, growing larger each day, whispers that surrender would bring peace. Understanding, transcendence. My flight to Ketchikan leaves in 3 days. I bought the ticket this morning, though I have no memory of doing so. I found the confirmation email in my inbox, along with a message from an unknown sender. Welcome back. We have been saving your place in the circle. I know I should not go. I know this is how it ends, how they claim another voice for their horrifying chorus. But the chanting never stops now, echoing in my skull day and night, and I am so very tired of resisting. If you ever hear about a photographer who disappeared in Alaska, who walked into a cave and never returned, remember this story. Remember that some horror cannot be escaped, only delayed. Remember that there are forces in this world beyond our understanding, patient and hungry, waiting in the dark places for someone foolish enough to find them. And whatever you do, stay away from the caves beneath Ketchikan when the fog rolls in and the tide comes high. Because if you hear voices in the darkness, if you feel that terrible pull toward something ancient and wrong, you will not be strong enough to resist. Nobody is. Story 2. Stick-on Screamer. There is something in the Alaskan wilderness that knows your name, and it's been hunting hikers along the Stick-on River for longer than anyone can remember. I am telling you this because I've seen it, and I'm still not entirely sure I survived. My name is Marcus, and I thought I was an experienced outdoorsman. I hiked the Appalachians, camped in the Canadian Rockies, survived 2 winters in Colorado. But nothing prepared me for what waits in the darkness along that river. Nothing could have. It started in late September when I decided to hike the Stick-on River Trail near Telegraph Creek, a small Alaskan town that feels abandoned even when people actually live there. The trail runs for 37 miles through dense forest, along a river so remote that most hikers only encounter wildlife. The locals warned me about staying out too late, about not hiking alone, about the screaming in the night. I didn't. Do you listen? I thought they were just playing up the local legend to scare tourists. That was the most terrifying mistake I've ever made. The first 2 days were normal, beautiful, even. The scenery was incredible, the weather held, and I felt that deep sense of peace that only comes from being completely isolated in nature. My tent was warm, my food was secure in bare canisters, and my satellite messenger was fully charged. Everything was fine. On the 3rd night, something changed. I was lying in my tent, listening to the river rush past just 50 yards away, when I heard it. A sound that I still can accurately describe. It was like a scream, but not human. Not quite animal either. It had a quality to it that made my entire nervous system react with pure, primal fear. The sound seemed to vibrate through the ground itself, through my sleeping bag, through my chest. It lasted for maybe 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds felt eternal. I told myself it was a moose in distress or a wolf caught in a trap. I told myself that every nightmare scenario I ever read about was statistically unlikely. But my hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't hold my phone. My breathing had become shallow and rapid. Something fundamental in my consciousness was screaming that I needed to leave. Right then, immediately, the screaming came again, closer this time. And this time, I realized it wasn't coming from just one location. The sound seemed to echo from multiple directions simultaneously, as if whatever was making that horrifying noise was surrounding me. The quality of the scream was disturbing in a way I couldn't explain. There was something almost intentional about it, something that suggested intelligence and malevolence behind that unsettling, terrifying sound. I zipped up my tent tighter, knowing it was a futile gesture. A tent made of thin nylon wouldn't stop anything determined to get inside. I gripped my bear spray and my knife, those pathetic human tools that suddenly felt completely inadequate against whatever was out there in the darkness. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my ribs. The forest had gone silent, completely, unnaturally silent. No insects, no rustling of small animals, no wind through the trees. The silence was almost worse than the screaming because it meant the forest was afraid too. All the wildlife had gone into hiding, retreating from something that even they understood represented danger at a level beyond their comprehension. Then I heard the footsteps, heavy footsteps, much heavier than a man's weight could create, moving through the forest with a deliberate pace. The ground was shaking slightly with each step. Whatever this thing was, it was large, massive. I held my breath, pressing myself against the back of my tent, trying to make myself as small as possible. The footsteps circled my tent, once, twice, 3 times around the small nylon shelter. I could hear something sniffing, could hear the sound of massive claws scraping against rock and fallen logs. The creature was investigating, examining my tent with what felt like sadistic curiosity. Every second felt like an hour. Every breath felt like it might be my last. Then it stopped. The footsteps halted directly in front of my tent entrance. I could see a shape through the nylon, a massive silhouette backlit by the moonlight. The shape was wrong. Parts of it seemed almost human, but the proportions were grotesquely distorted. The shoulders were too broad, the arms too long, and where the head should be, there was something that looked almost like antlers, twisted and ancient. I realized I was looking at the stick-eyed screamer, the creature I dismissed as local folklore, the thing that ranchers blamed for missing livestock, the nightmare that hikers around Telegraph Creek whispered about after dark. It was real. It was here. And it was staring at my tent. The tent fabric started to tear, just small rips at first, as if the creature was testing the material, curious about what would happen. My hands moved on their own, pressing the knife forward, trying to stab through the tent at the approaching darkness. The blade sank into something soft and warm, and the creature screamed. That scream will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a sound that contained centuries of rage and hunger and something that might have been pain. It was a creepy, chilling sound that seemed to resonate with every bone in my body. The creature thrashed backward, tearing a massive hole in my tent, and I scrambled out into the night. I ran. I didn't think about direction or safety or rationality. I just ran through the forest, branches whipping at my face, drawing blood, tearing my jacket to shreds. Behind me, I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush, could hear that horrifying, unsettling screaming getting closer. My lungs burned. My legs felt like lead. But fear drove me forward with a strength I didn't know I possessed. The river appeared suddenly before me, black water reflecting the moonlight. The current looked fast, probably too fast to cross safely, but crossing it seemed like my only chance. The creature was close enough now that I could hear its breathing, could hear the sound of its enormous body moving through the dense forest. Without hesitation, I plunged into the water. The cold was shocking, brutal, stealing the breath from my lungs. But the river carried me downstream, away from the creature. I grabbed at the rocky shore, trying to pull myself out. trying to get back to solid ground. My fingers were numb. My entire body was shaking so violently I could barely move. That is when I saw the bodies. 3 of them, arranged along the rocky shore, partially hidden behind a massive boulder. They'd been hikers once. Now they were something else, mangled beyond recognition. Pieces of them scattered across the rocks and into the water. I could see clothing that looked relatively fresh, a backpack with patches from other countries, a hiking boot with a foot still inside it. This was the reason the locals warned people about the stick-on screamer. This was what happened when you ventured into the wilderness alone, when you ignored the creepy, eerie warnings about staying close to town. The creature didn't just hunt. It collected. I pulled myself up onto the shore, gasping, retching, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Behind me, I could hear the creature approaching the river's edge. I didn't wait to see if it would cross. I ran inland, away from the river, deeper into the darkness of the Alaskan forest. I don't know how long I ran or how far I traveled. My mind had entered a state of pure survival instinct, stripped of higher reasoning. All I knew was movement and fear and the terrifying, unsettling knowledge that something was hunting me through the darkness. Eventually, my legs gave out. I collapsed against a massive spruce tree, my body racked with sobs that I couldn't control. I sat there in the darkness, completely lost, completely alone, waiting for the screaming to come again. But it didn't. The forest had returned to its normal sounds. The insects had resumed their chorus. The wind was moving through the branches again. Whatever had been hunting me seemed to have given up the chase, at least for now. I don't remember how I made it back to Telegraph Creek. I remember walking through the night, through what must have been 8 or 9 miles of wilderness, following the sound of distant traffic on a road I couldn't quite find. I remember my clothes drying as I walked, my wounds starting to clot. I remember the sun rising and feeling shocked that I survived to see it. When I stumbled into the small town and collapsed at the local ranger station, the officer who found me took one look at my condition and immediately called for medical assistance. They took me to the nearest hospital, 2 hours away by helicopter. The doctor said I was suffering from severe exposure, dehydration, and numerous lacerations, but that I would survive. The authorities investigated the bodies along the Stikine River. They found the remains I had seen, plus evidence of many others, scattered across miles of terrain. Some were weeks old, some were much, much older. The official explanation was that they were victims of animal attacks, likely from bears and wolves. The case was closed, but I know what I saw. I know what that creature was, and I know that the screaming I heard wasn't the cry of a normal animal. It was intentional, it was predatory, it was the hunting sound of something that had learned to target humans, something that understood fear and how to create it. The most terrifying thing is this: I'm not the same person who walked into that forest. Sometimes I hear the screaming in my nightmares, that unsettling, horrifying sound that made my blood freeze. Sometimes I'll be walking through a normal city street, surrounded by people, and I'll smell something wild and ancient, and I'll know that whatever I encountered along the Stikine River is still out there. The Stikine screamer didn't just hunt me. It marked me somehow, changed me, and I'm convinced that if I ever returned to that forest, it would recognize my scent. It would know exactly who I am. The locals in Telegraph Creek still warn hikers about the screaming in the night, about the danger lurking in the remote wilderness along the river. They tell stories about the mangled remains, the terrifying evidence of what the Stikine screamer does to those who venture too far into its territory. Now I understand why they warn people. They were not trying to protect hikers from a monster. They were trying to protect the monster from hikers who might not survive the encounter. Because once they've seen it, once they heard that chilling, eerie scream, you understand that some things in the Alaskan wilderness aren't meant to be found. And some things, once they found you, never really let you go. Story 3. Circle in Bethel. I know why people kill themselves at the traffic circle in Bethel, Alaska, and I wish to God I did not. They sent me there to investigate a pattern. 17 suicides in 4 years, all at the same location, all during winter. I was a data analyst for the State Transportation Department, comfortable in my Anchorage office, dealing with statistics and spreadsheets. Nothing in my training prepared me for what I found in that frozen, forgotten place at the edge of the Yukon Delta. The assignment seemed straightforward. document the site, review police reports, interview locals, recommend safety improvements. A roundabout on the outskirts of town where the gravel road met the tundra. Nothing special about it on paper, but 17 people had walked to its center during the darkest months and ended their lives in horrifying ways. No note, no warning, just sudden, inexplicable violence against themselves. I flew into Bethel on a February afternoon when the sun barely cleared the horizon. The town squatted gray and desperate beneath an iron sky, a collection of worn buildings and muddy streets where the Kuskokwim River cuts through endless flatland. The cold hit different there, not just temperature, but something deeper. A bone cold, a soul cold that made my chest tight the moment I stepped off the plane. The locals did not want to talk about the circle. I went door to door with my clipboard and official identification, met with police officers and city council members, and everyone gave me the same empty stare. They would confirm the deaths happened, provide basic facts, then find reasons to end the conversation. The fear in their eyes was real and raw, the kind of terror that comes from knowing something terrible and being powerless to stop it. Only one person spoke freely. An old, IK woman named Mary who ran a small grocery near the center of town. She looked at me with sad, knowing eyes when I asked about the circle and told me I should leave before the darkness found me too. She said the land remembered things, that some places became stained by old violence and never healed. The traffic circle sat on ground that had been cursed long before white people built their roads. I thanked her and left, dismissing her words as superstition. I had a job to do, data to collect, a rational explanation to find. The scientific method does not account for curses or haunted ground. That night, I drove out to see the circle myself. My rental truck bounced over frozen ruts, headlights cutting through darkness so complete it felt solid. The roundabout appeared suddenly, a perfect loop of gravel and compacted snow maybe 40 feet across, marking where the main road split toward different villages. Nothing grew in its center, just bare earth, frozen hard, darker than the surrounding tundra. I parked and stepped out into screaming wind. The cold attacked my exposed skin immediately, turning my breath to ice crystals. But worse than the cold was the silence beneath the wind. A vast, empty quiet that seemed to absorb sound, to swallow it into the frozen ground. My footsteps made no echo. The truck engine behind me faded to nothing. And then I heard it, a sound like breathing, slow and deep and rhythmic, coming from everywhere and nowhere. I spun around, flashlight beam jerking across the snow, but saw nothing. Just darkness and wind and that terrible breathing that matched the pulse in my own ears. I got back in the truck and drove to my motel, telling myself it was wind over ice, acoustic tricks of the landscape. But my hands shook on the steering wheel, and I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see something following. The next 3 days, I threw myself into research. Police reports painted a disturbing picture. The victims were all different. Men and women, young and old, native and white, locals and visitors. No common thread except timing and location. They would be seen walking toward the circle, moving with strange purpose. And by the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was too late. Some used knives. Some used rope. One man had clawed his own throat open with his bare hands. But the detail that made my blood freeze came from the autopsy reports. Every victim had been found facing the exact center of the circle. Every single one, positioned like compass points around that bare patch of dark earth. 17 bodies over 4 years, all oriented inward toward something unseen. I interviewed the last person to see one of the victims alive. A truck driver named Tom who had passed the circle the night a young teacher named Sarah died. He described seeing her standing in the center, perfectly still, head tilted back toward the black sky. He almost stopped, but something made him keep driving. Something about the way she stood. He said, too rigid, too focused, like she was listening to something he could not hear. When he called it in from the next town, she was already dead. That week, I started having the dreams. Not normal dreams, visions that felt like memories from someone else's mind. I saw the traffic circle before the road existed, when it was just tundra and sky. But in the dreams, the ground was different, disturbed, like something had pushed up from below, leaving a circular scar in the earth. And I felt the breathing, that slow, patient breathing I had heard standing beside the circle. I began to understand that the roundabout had not created the problem. Someone had built it there because of the geography, because roads have to go somewhere, because that spot made practical sense for traffic flow. They never knew they were paving over something ancient and wrong, My investigation stretched into the second week. The darkness seemed to deepen each day, the sun barely rising above the horizon before plunging back down. And I felt it more strongly now. A pull, a whisper at the edge of my thoughts suggesting I drive out to the circle, that I needed to see it again, needed to stand in its center and understand. I fought it, stayed in my motel room reviewing documents, making phone calls to Anchorage, anything to avoid going back. But the compulsion grew like hunger, like thirst, like a need I could not name or deny. On the 13th night, I found myself driving toward the circle with no memory of getting in the truck. The realization hit me on the dark road, terror flooding my system as I discovered my hands on the wheel, my foot on the gas, heading exactly where I had sworn not to go. I tried to turn around, but my body would not obey. Something else was driving now. I parked at the circle and walked to its center. The fear was overwhelming, but beneath it ran a strange calm, a certainty that this was inevitable. The breathing sound returned, louder now, and I realized it came from the ground itself. The frozen earth pulsed with it, rising and falling in slow rhythm. And then I saw them, not with my eyes, but with something deeper. The 17 who had died here. They stood around me in the darkness, transparent and terrible, still facing inward, still watching the center. Waiting. They were not ghosts. They were warnings, markers, showing me what happens to those who get too close. Because something lived beneath the circle, something old and vast that breathed in centuries instead of seconds. It had been sleeping when the IK people first came to this land, dreaming deep beneath the permafrost. But sometimes it woke enough to feed, to pull someone down into its awareness and consume them slowly, drinking their warmth and life and self until only an empty shell remained, compelled to destroy itself above the thing, its resting place. I could feel it now, huge and cold and patient, its attention turning toward me. It knew I was there. It knew I understood. And it was so terribly hungry. The pull to end myself was overwhelming. My hand moved to my pocket, searching for something sharp, something final. My mind screamed, but my body belonged to something else, something that breathed beneath my feet and wanted me to join the others, to become another marker, another warning that no one would heed. I do not know how I broke free. Maybe I was not yet ready. Maybe it had not fully woken. But suddenly I was running, stumbling through snow back to my truck, my own breathing ragged and desperate. I started the engine and drove, did not stop until I reached the airport, bought a ticket on the next flight out, left everything behind. That was 6 months ago. I never filed my report, told my supervisor I got food poisoning and had to evacuate for medical treatment. They sent someone else to complete the investigation. He lasted 2 weeks before requesting immediate transfer. The official report recommended better lighting and warning signs, but nothing changed. Nothing could change. You cannot fix cursed ground with safety improvements. I left Alaska and moved to Phoenix, as far from that frozen darkness as I could get. But distance means nothing. I still feel it sometimes, especially during winter nights when the temperature drops. That slow breathing, that patient hunger, it touched me once, and part of me will always be standing in that circle, feeling it wake beneath my feet. 3 more people have died there since I left. The count is 20 now. The pattern continues, accelerating. Every year the darkness lasts longer, and every year it takes more. Eventually, someone will realize the truth, that the suicides are not the problem but the symptom, that something beneath Bethel is waking up after sleeping for 10,000 years. And when it fully wakes, when it finally pushes through that thin layer of frozen earth, the traffic circle will not matter anymore. The whole town will not matter. Because whatever breathes beneath that ground is vast beyond comprehension, and it has been dreaming of the surface for longer than human civilization has existed. I tried to warn people, sent anonymous emails to state officials, posted warnings online, called reporters. No one listened. How could they? I sound insane, a man raving about monsters under Alaska. But I saw the thing, its dreams. I felt its hunger, and I know that every person who dies at that circle feeds it, strengthens it, brings it closer to waking completely. So I am writing this as a final warning and confession. If you ever find yourself in Bethel, do not go near the traffic circle on the outskirts of town. Do not drive past it at night. Do not stop. Do not look at the center. Because if you feel that pull, if you hear that breathing, if you sense something huge and ancient turning its attention toward you, it is already too late. The thing beneath Bethel is patient. It has waited for millennia. It can wait a few more years for the right moment, the right weakness in the world above. And when that moment comes, when the earth finally cracks and releases what has been trapped below, no one will be ready for the horror that emerges. I moved to the desert to escape the cold, but some nights I wake in terror, feeling ice in my bones and darkness in my mind. I stand at my window facing north, toward Alaska, toward that circle, and I swear I can still hear it breathing, growing stronger, getting ready, and I wonder if I am really free, or if I am just another marker, another warning that no one will understand until it is far too late. Because the thing beneath Bethel does not forget, it does not release, and everyone who has stood in that circle, everyone who has felt its attention, belongs to it now. We are all just waiting for it to call us home. Story 4. Ghost Train of the White Pass. I heard the whistle 3 times before I realized the train I was chasing had been gone for over a century. My name is Daniel Reeves, and I moved to Skagway, Alaska 6 months ago to escape a life that had fallen apart in Seattle. Divorced, unemployed, drowning in debt and bad decisions, the small town seemed like the perfect place to disappear and start over. What I found instead was something horrifying beyond imagination, something that still haunts my every waking moment. Skagway sits at the northern end of the Inside Passage, a town that exploded during the Klondike Gold Rush and then slowly died when the gold ran out. These days, it survives on cruise ship tourists who flood the streets for a few hours before disappearing back to their floating cities. I took a job as a night maintenance worker for the White Pass and Yukon Route Railroad, the historic line that once carried desperate miners and their dreams up through the mountains toward the Canadian border. The pay was decent and the work was solitary, which suited me fine. I spent my nights walking the tracks, checking for damage, clearing debris, making sure everything was safe for the tourist trains that ran during the day. Just me, the darkness, and the eerie silence of the Alaskan wilderness pressing in from all sides. My supervisor, a grizzled local named Bill who had worked the railroad for 30 years, gave me one specific instruction during my first shift. If I heard a train whistle after midnight, I was to immediately leave the tracks and not return until dawn. I asked him why. He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much, that carried a weight of terrible knowledge, and told me some things were better left alone. The creepy way he said it, the fear barely hidden beneath his gruff exterior, should have been warning enough. But I was new, skeptical, still convinced the world operated according to rational rules. I learned otherwise. The first month passed without incident. The work was peaceful in its own way, walking those historic rails under the vast Alaska sky. The northern lights often danced overhead, casting an unsettling green glow across the landscape. Forests pressed close on either side, dense with spruce and hemlock, the kind of woods where you could lose yourself and never be found. The mountains loomed beyond, their peaks lost in darkness, ancient and indifferent to human suffering. Then, on a Tuesday night in early October, I heard it for the first time. A train whistle, distant but distinct, echoing through the mountain pass. 3 long blasts that sent a chill racing down my spine. I checked my watch. 12:47 a.m. No trains ran this late. The tourist schedule ended hours ago, and freight service had been discontinued years back. I stood frozen on the tracks, listening as the whistle came again. Closer now. 3 more blasts that seemed to carry something beyond mere sound. A desperate quality, a warning, or perhaps a summons. My rational mind insisted it was an echo, some acoustic trick of the mountains. But deep in my gut, in that primitive part of the brain that remembers when humans were prey, I knew better. Something was wrong. Something was deeply, terrifyingly wrong. I should have left the tracks. Should have heeded Bill's warning. Instead, I did what curious people always do in horror stories. I walked toward the sound. The rails stretched ahead into darkness, twin lines of steel disappearing around a bend. I followed them, my flashlight beam cutting weakly through the night. The forest seemed to press closer with each step, trees leaning in like spectators at some terrible event. The whistle came again, and this time I felt it as much as heard it, a vibration that seemed to resonate in my bones. Then I saw the light. A single headlamp, old-fashioned and flickering, emerged from around the bend. Behind it, the dark silhouette of a locomotive materialized from the shadows. Not a modern engine, but something from another era. A steam engine, its smokestacks belching clouds that glowed with an eerie phosphorescence in the darkness. I stood paralyzed as the ghost train approached. The details became clearer with each passing second, and each detail was more disturbing than the last. The locomotive was ancient, probably from the early 1900s. Its metal body covered in rust and decay that should have made movement impossible. Windows were shattered, paint had peeled away in long strips, and yet it moved, grinding forward on rails that screamed in protest beneath its impossible weight. Behind the engine, I could see passenger cars. 5 of them, swaying slightly, their windows dark except for a faint, sickly glow from within. And in those windows, I saw faces. Dozens of faces pressed against the glass, staring out with expressions of absolute terror and desperation. The whistle blasted again, so close now it felt like it was inside my skull. I stumbled backward, finally understanding the danger, finally grasping why Bill had warned me to flee. But my legs would not cooperate, frozen by a fear so profound it bypassed rational thought and struck directly at the animal brain. The ghost train passed within 20 feet of where I stood. I could feel the heat radiating from its impossible boiler, smell the acrid scent of burning coal that should not exist, hear the chuffing of pistons and the grinding of wheels. And I could see the passengers more clearly now. Men, mostly, dressed in clothes from the gold rush era, canvas pants and wool coats and battered hats. Their faces were gray, skin hanging loose like wax beginning to melt. Their eyes were the worst part, wide and white and utterly hollow, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. They stared at me with an intensity that felt like hooks sinking into my flesh. The train passed, disappearing around another bend, its whistle fading into the distance. But the sound did not fade completely. It lingered in the air, in my ears, in my memory, a haunting note that I knew I would hear for the rest of my life. I ran back to the maintenance station, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. Bill was there, waiting, somehow knowing what had happened before I said a word. He poured me coffee with shaking hands and told me the story. In the winter of 1908, during the height of the gold rush, a passenger train left Skagway headed for the Canadian border. 57 miners aboard, all carrying their stakes, their dreams, their desperate hopes for wealth. A late-season storm rolled in without warning, temperatures dropping to 40 below. The train made it halfway up the pass before the tracks ahead collapsed in an avalanche. The engineer tried to reverse course, but ice had formed on the rails. The train could not gain traction. It sat trapped while the storm raged for 3 days. 57 men froze to death in those passenger cars, huddled together for warmth that never came, crying out for rescue that never arrived. When they finally cleared the tracks and reached the train, every man was dead. Frozen solid in positions that suggested their final moments had been filled with unspeakable horror. The railroad buried the incident, afraid it would scare off potential passengers and kill their business. They recovered the bodies but left the train where it sat, unable to move it, eventually just building new tracks around it and letting the forest reclaim the old road. But the miners never left. Every year, around the anniversary of their deaths, the ghost train runs its road again. And anyone who sees it, anyone who looks into the windows and meets the eyes of those frozen dead, becomes marked. The train remembers them. And eventually, it comes back. I wanted to believe Bill was crazy, that he was just repeating local legend to scare the new guy. But I had seen it. I had felt the heat from its impossible boiler, smelled the coal smoke, heard the desperate whistle. The ghost train was real, and now it knew I existed. The nightmares started that very night. Dreams of being trapped in a passenger car while cold seeped through every crack, while ice formed on windows and breath froze in lungs. Dreams of watching the world outside dim and darken as hypothermia shut down my body piece by piece. Dreams of dead men with hollow eyes reaching for me with frozen fingers. I woke up shivering despite the heated room, my teeth chattering, fingers numb. The cold felt real in a way that transcended normal sensation. It felt like it was coming from inside me, spreading through my veins, turning my blood to ice water. I tried to quit the next day. Bill refused to accept my resignation. He told me it was too late for that. Once the train marked you, leaving town would not help. The only way to break free was to face it, to understand what it wanted. Otherwise, the cold would slowly claim me no matter where I went, and one day I would simply freeze to death on the spot, even if I was standing in the middle of summer sunshine. I spent the next 2 weeks researching the incident, old newspaper archives, historical society records, mining journals. The official story matched what Bill had told me, but I found discrepancies, conflicting accounts. Witnesses who claimed to have seen the train in later years, always at night, always accompanied by that terrible whistle. And I found something else. A pattern. Every 10 years, like clockwork, someone in Skagway disappeared. Always during October. Always someone who worked the night shift on the railroad. The disappearances went back decades. A creepy trail of missing persons that no one seemed to connect or even notice. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The ghost train did not just appear. It hunted. It took people. And this year, I was the target. The fear became a constant companion, a disturbing presence that colored every moment. I stopped sleeping properly, afraid of the dreams, afraid of the cold that crept into my bones. I avoided the railroad, calling in sick, making excuses. But the whistle still came. I heard it in my apartment, echoing through the streets, calling to me with increasing urgency. Then, 3 weeks after my first sighting, I saw the passengers outside the train. I was walking home from the grocery store, taking a shortcut through an alley, when I saw them. 5 figures standing in the shadows, dressed in Gold Rush-era clothes, their gray faces turned toward me. They did not move, did not speak, just stood there with those horrible hollow eyes fixed on me with disturbing intensity. I ran, but everywhere I went, I saw them, standing on street corners, watching from windows, following me with that same terrifying patience. The dead miners had left their phantom train and entered the real world, drawn by some connection I did not understand, hunting me with the persistence of those who have nothing but time. Bill finally told me the truth. The train needed a new passenger. Every 10 years, it grew hungry and came hunting for someone to add to its frozen collection. The only way to break free was to find someone else to take your place. To mark them, to lead them to the tracks, to let the train claim them instead. I refused. I would not condemn another person to that fate, would not become a monster to save myself. But the cold was getting worse. My fingers had started turning blue. Ice crystals formed in my breath even indoors. The nightmares had become so vivid I could no longer tell where sleep ended and waking began. I was dying, slowly freezing from the inside out, succumbing to the same fate that claimed those 57 miners over a century ago. In desperation, I decided to confront the train directly. If it wanted me, it could take me. But I would face it on my terms, not as a victim but as someone choosing their fate. On October 31st, exactly 1 month after my first sighting, I walked out to the tracks at midnight. The whistle came almost immediately, 3 long blasts that echoed through the mountains. The ghost train emerged from the darkness, its ancient engine grinding forward, passenger cars swaying behind. I stood in the middle of the tracks and did not move. The train should have passed through me like smoke. Instead, it stopped. The engine halted mere feet away, steam hissing from its joints, the smell of coal overwhelming. The passenger car door swung open with a rusty shriek. Inside, I could see them all. 57 frozen miners, their gray faces turned toward me, hollow eyes reflecting the dim light. They were not just dead. They were trapped, endlessly reliving that terrible 3-day freeze, unable to move on, unable to find peace. And I understood. The train did not want to claim me. It wanted to be released. Those miners had been calling out for over a century, their whistle a desperate plea for someone to hear them, to acknowledge their suffering, to set them free. I stepped onto the train. The cold hit me immediately, so intense it stole my breath. Ice formed on every surface. The miners stared at me with expressions that mixed terror and hope. And in that moment of connection, of truly seeing them and bearing witness to their horror, something shifted. The warmth rushed back into my body. The hollow eyes of the dead miners filled with light, with recognition, with something almost like gratitude. The train shuddered, and one by one, the passengers faded away, finally released from their frozen prison. The ghost train dissolved around me, leaving me standing alone on the tracks in the cold October night. The whistle came one last time, but it sounded different now. Not desperate or haunting, but peaceful. A final goodbye before fading into silence. I walked back to town as the first light of dawn touched the mountains. The cold had left me completely. The nightmares ended. The ghost train of the White Pass had finally completed its last run. But sometimes, on quiet October nights, I still hear that whistle echoing through the pass. Not calling for me, but reminding me. 57 men died horrible deaths and spent over a century trapped in darkness because everyone chose to forget them. Sometimes the dead do not haunt us because they are evil. They haunt us because we failed to remember they were human. Story 5, Ukiyagvik Stalker. I found wet footprints in my bedroom this morning, and I know for certain that I locked every door and window in my house last night. The footprints are still there, evaporating slowly in the dry Alaskan air. and they don't belong to anyone in my family. They belong to something else, something that came into my home while I was sleeping, something that the locals in Utqiagvik call the Inukik stalker. My name is David, and I lived in this small Arctic town for 3 years. I thought I understood what it meant to live in isolation, to endure the endless darkness of an Alaskan winter, to accept the creepy, eerie things that people whisper about in quiet moments. But I was wrong about all of it. The first time I heard about the stalker was at the grocery store, maybe 6 months after I moved here. A woman was telling another customer about her experience, her voice low and unsettling, her hands shaking slightly as she described what happened. She said something had come into her house at night. She didn't know how. She didn't know when. But she woke up to a smell, a horrifying, chilling odor of salt water and something dead. The footprints, she said, were everywhere. Wet footprints that smelled of seaweed and decay, leading from her bedroom to her kitchen, then disappearing at her front door. The police came, took statements, and basically told her it was probably a seal or sea lion that had wandered inland. But everyone in the store knew that was impossible. Seals don't climb through windows. Seals don't leave human-shaped prints. And seals certainly don't enter homes with what seems like deliberate, intentional purpose. I had dismissed it as town folklore, the kind of scary stories small communities tell about themselves to break up the monotony of darkness and isolation. I thought it was exaggerated, probably rooted in some misunderstanding or a real but explainable event that had grown into legend over time. That was before it came to my house. The terror started small. I began finding things out of place. A coffee mug on the kitchen counter that I didn't remember putting there. My bedroom closet door opened when I knew I had closed it. The thermostat turned down to 50 degrees in the middle of the night. I told myself I was forgetting things, that stress was making me paranoid, that the darkness and isolation were playing tricks on my mind. But then I smelled it, that same smell the woman had described. Salt water mixed with something organic and rotten. Something that belonged in the depths of the Arctic Ocean, not in my comfortable suburban home. The smell came from my hallway, faint at first, then stronger. I turned on every light in my house, gripping a baseball bat, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. There were no intruders, no broken windows, no signs of forced entry. Everything was locked exactly as I had left it. But the smell lingered, and my fear began to transform into something darker and more terrifying. Something was getting inside my house, and I had no idea how or why. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on my couch with all the lights on, the bat across my lap, waiting for something to happen. Around 3 a.m, I heard it. A sound like water dripping, a wet, rhythmic sound coming from upstairs. Drip, 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 moving slowly through my master bedroom. I forced myself up the stairs, every nerve screaming at me to turn around, to leave my house, to run into the Arctic darkness. But I couldn't. This was my home. I needed to know what was happening. In my bedroom, I found the source of the sound. Wet footprints, perfect human footprints, each one glistening with seawater, arranged in a neat line across my hardwood floor. Starting from nowhere, ending at my bed, the stalker had stood there, looking down at me while I slept. The realization made my stomach turn, made my entire body convulse with a fear so profound that I thought I might be sick. I called the police. Officer Wilson came about 20 minutes later, flashlight in hand, his expression skeptical. He examined the footprints while I watched, my entire body trembling with a combination of cold and absolute terror. He photographed them, measured them, and asked me questions that all seemed to presume I was somehow responsible for them myself. But Wilson was a good cop, and I could see something shift in his expression as he examined the scene more carefully. The prints were large, significantly larger than my size 10 shoes. The pattern suggested something heavy, something with a disturbing, unsettling gait. And most importantly, there was no possible way they could have gotten there without entering through a locked door or window. Officer Wilson told me about the other cases. In the past 18 months, there had been 9 reported incidents. A woman found wet footprints in her living room. An elderly man discovered his kitchen flooded with seawater, the walls dripping with brine, but every window and door locked from the inside. A family woke up to find their entire upstairs reeking of the ocean, with dark, muddy prints tracking through every bedroom. The official explanation remained unchanged: animal intrusion, probably related to shifts in Arctic wildlife patterns. But the unofficial explanation, the one that the people of Utqiagvik whispered about when they thought no one was listening, was far more disturbing. Something was coming out of the ocean, something that moved between worlds, that existed in the space between the Arctic waters and human civilization. Something that the old Inuit legends called the Inukik, a creature from the water that walked on land wearing the shape of a man. Over the next week, the visits escalated. The stalker came every night. I installed new locks, reinforced my windows, filled gaps with weather stripping, but none of it mattered. The footprints still appeared. The smell grew stronger, more pervasive, starting to seep into my clothes and hair. I was beginning to smell like the ocean, like salt and seaweed in something ancient and terrifying. I barely slept. When I did, I had nightmares of something wet and cold climbing into bed beside me, of webbed fingers touching my face, of a smell that was so overwhelming it filled my lungs and choked me. I lost weight. My coworkers at the construction company where I worked began asking if I was sick. I told them I was fine, but everyone could see that I was falling apart. The most horrifying part was that I began to understand something. The stalker wasn't trying to hurt me. It was trying to communicate. The placements of the footprints, the way they led to specific rooms, the objects it moved, it all seemed deliberate, intentional, purposeful. It was trying to tell me something, and the creepy realization that I couldn't to understand the message made my paranoia worse with each passing day. One night, I found something different. Instead of footprints, there was a message, written in wet sand on my kitchen tile, in letters 3 feet tall. Come. Just that one word, come. The message was unmistakable, the meaning clear, and the terror that seized my heart was unlike anything I'd experienced before. I packed a bag that night. I was leaving Utqiagvik, leaving Alaska, leaving this nightmare behind. But when I got to the airport the next morning, the eerie realization hit me. The stalker had stopped coming. No footprints, no smell, no wet sand messages. It was as if it knew I was trying to escape, and it had decided to let me go. Or perhaps it had already accomplished what it needed to accomplish. I made it as far as Anchorage before I had to turn around. The dreams had started, horrifying, chilling visions of the Arctic Ocean, of vast depths and things moving through the darkness below. The dreams were so vivid, so terrifying, that I couldn't sleep. And when I wasn't dreaming, I felt a pull, an unsettling, disturbing compulsion to return to Utqiagvik, to return to the coast, to return to the water. I'm back in my house now. I've stopped trying to fight it. The footprints appear every night, and I find myself studying them, trying to understand their patterns, their meanings. My skin has developed a strange quality, a dampness that won't go away no matter how much I dry off. The smell of salt water is now emanating from my own body. Last night, I walked down to the beach in the darkness. I don't remember deciding to go. I don't remember leaving my house, but I found myself standing at the edge of the Arctic Ocean, the water lapping at my feet, the cold so intense that my body should have shut down. But I didn't feel cold anymore. I felt something else. Recognition. A sense of coming home to a place I'd never been but had always belonged to. I waded deeper into the water. The fear had transformed into something else, something that might have been acceptance or resignation or the early stages of something far more frightening. The darkness beneath the surface was calling to me, and I could hear voices in the water, chilling, eerie voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. I don't know if I'm still entirely human. I don't know if the thing that wears my face is still the same David who moved to Utqiagvik 3 years ago. All I know is that the Inukik stalker has been patient, methodical, terrifying in its purpose. It didn't come to my house to terrorize me or to hurt me. It came to change me. It came to call me home. And the most horrifying realization is this. Now that I understand the pattern, I can see the footprints in other houses around town. I can smell the salt water in other homes, see the wet marks on other families' floors. The stalker is still walking the streets of Utqiagvik, still coming into houses at night, still leaving its eerie, unsettling messages. It's collecting us, one by one, home by home. It is gathering those of us who are meant to return to the water. And when it has enough, when the pull becomes too strong to resist, we all walk into the Arctic Ocean together, and Utqiagvik will become a town of empty houses. The locals know this is happening. I can see it in their eyes when they look at me on the street. They see what I becoming. They recognize the pattern because they've seen it before, many times before, stretching back through decades of disappearances and unexplained deaths. But they don't warn us. They don't try to stop it. Because deep down, in the part of them that remembers the old stories, they understand that some things cannot be stopped. Some things can only be accepted. The water calls, the Inukik walks, and soon, LL answer, very soon. Story 6. What rises from Prince William Sound? I pulled up a net full of human skulls 3 miles off the coast of Cordova, Alaska. 7 of them. Their eye sockets glowed with an eerie blue-green light that should not exist in nature. That was 6 months ago, and I have not slept through a single night since. Because what came up with those skulls was just the beginning of something horrifying that lives in the depths of Prince William Sound. My name is Michael, and I have been a commercial fisherman for 22 years. I know these waters better than I know my own home. I have seen strange things before. Weird currents, unusual catches, the occasional oddity that makes you wonder. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered that gray October morning when the fog sat so thick on the water you could barely see your own hands. I was running my trawler solo that day. My usual deckhand called in sick, but the forecast showed rough weather coming, and I needed to get one more haul before the storm hit. The nets went down around dawn in a spot I had fished 100 times before. Good depth, rocky bottom, usually filled with halibut and rockfish. When I started hauling up, the winch groaned like it was pulling up something impossibly heavy. I figured I had snagged the bottom or caught a submerged log. Then the net broke the surface, and my blood turned to ice. Skulls, human skulls tangled in the netting. No bodies, no bones, just 7 intact skulls, pale and clean like they had been picked spotless by something underwater. But the truly disturbing part was the light. Their eye sockets glowed with bioluminescent algae, pulsing slowly like they were breathing. The blue-green luminescence was so bright I could see it even in the morning light. It painted the deck of my boat in scary, shifting shadows that moved on their own. I should have radioed the Coast Guard immediately. Should have reported finding human remains, but something stopped me. Call it instinct or fear or the creepy feeling that whatever put those skulls in my net was watching me from below. I stared at them for a full minute, watching that eerie light pulse, and I swear I felt something staring back. Not from the skulls themselves, but from the water, from the darkness beneath my boat. Something aware and patient and hungry. I dumped the skulls back overboard. I know that sounds insane. I know I destroyed evidence and probably broke a dozen laws, but the terror that gripped me in that moment was absolute. Those glowing eye sockets felt like windows into something that should stay hidden in the deepest parts of the ocean. I cut the net loose and headed back to Cordova at full throttle, not caring about the lost gear or the wasted fuel. I just needed to be off that water. Back at the harbor, I asked around. Carefully, I mentioned seeing something strange in my nets without giving details. 3 other fishermen admitted they had pulled up skulls too, all within the last month, all in different locations around Prince William Sound, all with that same horrifying bioluminescent glow in the eye sockets. None of them reported it either. We all felt the same unsettling dread, the same certainty that whatever was putting human skulls in fishing nets was not something the authorities could handle. An old-timer named Ray pulled me aside at the bar that night. He had been fishing these waters for 40 years, and his face looked haunted when he spoke. He told me the skulls had been appearing in nets for decades. Not often, maybe once or twice a year, but consistent enough that the old fishermen knew about it and kept quiet. They called it the harvest. Something down in Prince William Sound was collecting people, and every so often, it returned parts of them to the surface. The glowing algae was a marker, a sign, like the thing below was signing its work. Ray said the disappeared were never locals, always outsiders, tourists who rented kayaks and never came back, divers exploring wrecks who vanished without a trace, hikers who wandered too close to isolated beaches. Over the years, dozens of people had gone missing around the Sound, and the authorities blamed currents and cold water and accidents. But Ray knew better. He had pulled up 11 skulls in his career, 11 people claimed by whatever lived in the darkness below. I tried to forget. I went back to fishing in different waters, stayed away from the area where I found the skulls. But 3 weeks later, I got a call from the harbor master. My boat had drifted from its mooring during the night and was found floating a mile offshore. Engine off, no one aboard. But when the Coast Guard towed it back, they found something chilling on the deck. 7 stones arranged in a circle, smooth, black stones from the ocean floor, and in the center, a puddle of seawater that glowed faintly blue-green even in daylight. That was when I knew it had marked me. Whatever claimed those people had noticed me pulling up its message. It had visited my boat, left its own message in return. I was being invited to join the others in the depths. The thought made me physically sick with fear. I stopped fishing, put my boat up for sale, decided I was done with Prince William Sound forever. But the nightmares started immediately. Every night, I dreamed of sinking into dark water, of being pulled down by hands I could not see, of reaching the bottom and finding thousands of skulls scattered across the seafloor, all glowing with that eerie light, all watching me with empty sockets. And in the dreams, I understood. The skulls were not just remains. They were witnesses, watchers. They could see through the glowing algae like it was living tissue. Whatever controlled them was using them as eyes, searching the waters above for the next person to claim. I started researching old newspapers, missing person reports, maritime records. The pattern was undeniable and terrifying. People had been vanishing around Prince William Sound for over a century. Native legends spoke of something in the deep water, a spirit or creature that demanded tribute. The Chugach people avoided certain areas entirely, claimed that darkness lived there, and that it hungered for those who did not respect the ocean. One account from 1897 described a Russian fishing crew that pulled up a net full of skulls and then vanished the same night. Their boat was found drifting empty, but the deck was covered in that same black stone arrangement. Another report from 1943 mentioned a Navy diver who explored a deep trench near Cordova and emerged screaming about eyes in the darkness. Eyes that glowed and watched and belonged to something that was not fish or whale or anything natural. He refused to dive again and was eventually discharged for psychological reasons. The most disturbing account was from 1968. A marine biologist studied the bioluminescent algae samples taken from skulls retrieved by fishermen. He determined the algae was a unique species found nowhere else on Earth. It grew only in extreme depths and only seemed to colonize bone tissue. But the truly scary part was his final note before his research was classified. The algae appeared to respond to stimuli, to light and sound and presence. It was not just growing in the eye sockets. It was watching through them. I tried to sell my boat, but no one would buy it. Word had spread somehow. The other fishermen knew my boat had been marked. They would not touch it, would not even come near the dock where it was moored. I was trapped with a vessel that connected me to something in the deep that wanted me dead. 2 months ago, things escalated. I woke up one night to find my bedroom floor covered in seawater. Not from a leak or a flood, just there, pooling on the hardwood in patches that glowed faintly in the darkness. And in that glowing water, I saw shapes moving. Not reflections, actual forms swimming through 2 inches of liquid like it was an ocean. Skulls drifted past, hands reached up, faces formed and dissolved in the eerie light. I could hear sounds too, whispers in a language that hurt my ears. The groaning of something massive moving through deep water. The sensation of pressure building, like I was being dragged down even though I stood in my own home. The water evaporated by morning, leaving nothing but salt stains. I stopped sleeping in my house. Started staying with friends, never mentioning why. But the visitations followed me. Glowing puddles appeared wherever I spent the night. The whispers grew louder, and I started seeing them in every body of water. Bathtubs, puddles, even glasses of drinking water. Faces formed in the liquid, distorted and horrifying, watching me with glowing eyes. The thing from the deep was reaching through water itself to claim me. Last week, I made a decision. I was going to face whatever was in Prince William Sound. I was going to end this nightmare one way or another. I took my boat out alone at midnight, sailed back to the exact coordinates where I pulled up the skulls, and dropped anchor. The water was calm, unnaturally calm, like glass stretching to the horizon. I could see the moon reflected perfectly on the surface, and beneath that reflection, I saw movement. Shapes circling my boat in the depths. Glowing points of light rising slowly from below. They surfaced around me, dozens of skulls floating in the water, their eye sockets blazing with that terrible blue-green light. They formed a circle around my boat, bobbing gently in the current, all facing inward, all watching me. The water between them began to glow too, spreading like infection until my boat floated in a pool of luminescent seawater. And then something massive moved beneath the surface. Something so large its movement created waves that rocked my trawler like a toy. I saw it clearly in the glow, rising from the deep, a shape that made no sense to my eyes. Organic but wrong, like coral and kelp and bone fused into something that thought and moved with purpose. It had no face but hundreds of eyes. Human eyes, set into its surface like barnacles. All glowing, all seeing, all belonging to people it had claimed over decades or centuries. They watched me with expressions of horror frozen in dead tissue, and I understood finally what I was looking at. This thing was not a creature. It was a collection, a colony. It took people and incorporated them, used their eyes to see, their bones to grow, their terror to feed. It existed in the deepest trenches of Prince William Sound, ancient and patient and endlessly hungry. The skulls and the nets were not warnings or trophies. They were scouts, sensors it sent up to search for the next addition to its horrifying mass. It reached for my boat with appendages made of kelp and bone. I felt the deck tilt as it started to pull me under. The water rose over the railings, glowing and warm and alive with that eerie algae. I was going to join the others. I was going to become another set of eyes in the darkness. Another skull returned to the nets years later to terrify some other fishermen who would then be marked and claimed in turn. I did the only thing I could. I set fire to my boat, doused the deck in fuel and lit it all ablaze. The flames spread fast, consuming everything. The creature released its grip, pulling back from the fire, and in that moment, I jumped. I swam through the glowing water, feeling things brush against me in the darkness, feeling the cold grip of hands that wanted to drag me down. But I reached a life raft I had prepared and cut myself free of that cursed circle. I watched my boat burn and sink, taking the fire down into the water where it finally died in the depths. The glowing eyes watched it descend, then they turned to look at me, floating alone in my raft in the middle of Prince William Sound. And I knew with chilling certainty that I had only delayed the inevitable. It was still hungry, still watching, still waiting. I made it back to Cordova. I am leaving Alaska tomorrow, heading somewhere far from the ocean, somewhere I never have to see deep water again. But I know it does not matter. The thing in Prince William Sound marked me. I pulled up its message and now I am part of its pattern. Someday, it will reach through water and claim what it wants. Someday, my skull will appear in someone else's net, glowing with that eerie light, and the cycle will continue. If you fish in Prince William Sound and you pull up skulls with glowing eyes, throw them back. Cut your nets. Leave that water immediately. Do not ask questions. Do not investigate. Some mysteries exist because knowing the truth is more terrifying than ignorance. And whatever lives in those depths has been collecting people for longer than Cordova has existed. It will still be there long after the town is gone, patient, hungry, watching from the darkness below with 1,000 stolen eyes. Story 7. What they buried in Palmer. The official report says 43 people died in a fire at the Harmony Creek commune in 1976. But I have seen the foundations, and fire does not leave claw marks on concrete from the inside. I am a freelance journalist specializing in cold cases and forgotten American tragedies. Last spring, I received an anonymous package containing documents about the Palmer Colony Massacre, a term that appears nowhere in public records. Inside were police reports that had been redacted to nothing, photographs that showed things the newspapers never printed, and a handwritten note that simply read, "They are still there. Still contained. Come see before someone breaks the seal." The story I knew was simple. A hippie commune outside Palmer, Alaska, had burned down during a February blizzard in 1976. 43 dead. A tragic accident involving faulty wiring and harsh weather. The land was deemed unsafe, fenced off, and eventually absorbed into Matanuska Valley wilderness. Just another cautionary tale about idealists unprepared for Alaska's brutality. But the documents in that package told a different story. A horrifying story about something that came up from below, something that turned those 43 people into weapons against themselves before the government sealed it away with concrete and lies and a fence that was meant to keep things in, not out. I flew to Palmer in April, when snow still clung to the mountains but the valley had begun to thaw. The town sits in the shadow of Pioneer Peak, surrounded by farms that grow impossible vegetables in the long summer light. Normal, peaceful. Nothing about it suggested the darkness buried just 10 miles into the woods. I started at the Palmer Library, digging through microfiche of old newspapers. The coverage was minimal. Fire breaks out at Harmony Creek Commune. Multiple casualties. Investigation ongoing. Then nothing. The story vanished after a week, replaced by other news. No follow-up articles. No interviews with survivors. Because there were no survivors. The librarian, an older woman who had lived in Palmer her whole life, noticed what I was researching. She glanced around to make sure we were alone, then leaned close and whispered that I should let it stay buried. Her father had been part of the cleanup crew, and he came back changed, she said. He never spoke about what he saw, but he started sleeping with all the lights on and would not let anyone in their family go near that part of the valley. He died 10 years ago, still afraid of what might come back. That fear felt real and old, the kind that gets passed down through generations like a scar. I found the site the next day. The fence was still there, 8 feet of chain link topped with barbed wire, surrounding maybe 3 acres of dense forest. Signs every 20 feet warned of unstable ground and structural hazards. Do not enter. Do not disturb. The signs were new, replaced regularly, which meant someone still maintained this place decades after the supposed fire. I climbed the fence. The spring thaw had turned the ground to mud, and my boots sank deep as I pushed through bare alders toward the clearing. The forest felt wrong, too quiet. No birds, no wind sounds, just my breathing and the wet suck of mud at my feet. The foundations appeared suddenly, geometric patterns of poured concrete jutting from the earth. But the buildings themselves were completely gone. Not burned down, gone. Like they had been systematically demolished and removed, every trace of wood and metal stripped away. Only the concrete remained, and it told a story that made my skin crawl. The surfaces were covered in deep scratches, gouges that ran in desperate patterns toward what had been the building centers. Like dozens of hands had clawed at the concrete from the inside, trying to dig down, trying to get somewhere beneath the foundations. Some of the marks were worn smooth by weather, but others remained sharp and fresh, impossible after 48 years. And in the center of the largest foundation, someone had poured a massive concrete plug, easily 20 feet across and God knows how deep. The concrete was different from the original foundations, newer, reinforced with steel bands visible at the edges. This had been added after the fire, after whatever happened here. They had sealed something. I photographed everything, my hands shaking so badly the images came out blurred. Around the perimeter of the sealed area, I found small metal plates embedded in the concrete, each stamped with dates ranging from 1976 to present day. Inspection dates. Someone came here regularly to make sure the seal held. That night in my motel room, I went through the documents again, reading them with new understanding. The police reports mentioned sounds from beneath the commune buildings in the days before the fire. Residents complaining of vibrations, of rhythmic thumping that kept them awake. They thought it was geothermal activity, steam vents, or shifting permafrost. They had no idea something was trying to reach them from below. The photographs in the package showed the aftermath, and I had to force myself to look at them. Bodies arranged in circles around holes they had dug through the wooden floors with their bare hands. Fingers torn to bone. Faces frozen in expressions that were not fear but ecstasy. They had been trying to reach something, to uncover something, and whatever they found had consumed them. But the most disturbing photo showed military personnel in hazmat suits standing around one of the holes. Not firefighters, not police, military. And in the darkness of that hole, if you looked closely, you could see movement. Something pale and glistening that did not look remotely human. I tracked down the photographer through metadata on the original prints. He was an Army Corps of Engineers contractor named Robert Chen, now retired in Wasilla. It took 3 attempts before he agreed to meet me, and only after I proved I had seen the sealed foundations. We met at a diner on the edge of town. Robert was in his 70s, his hands constantly moving, folding and refolding his napkin. He told me that in 1976, he was part of the team that responded after the initial reports came through. They were told it was a structural collapse with chemical contamination that they needed to contain and document before cleanup. What they found was not a fire scene. The buildings were intact but empty. 43 bodies lay scattered in various rooms, all of them surrounding holes they had dug or clawed into the foundation. And from those holes came a sound that made his teeth ache, a deep thrumming that you felt in your bones rather than heard. His team was about to investigate the holes when something emerged from the largest one. He could not or would not describe exactly what he saw, but his eyes went distant and terrified at the memory. He said it was like watching biology work in reverse, like seeing evolution run backward to something that should not exist. The thing was aware, intelligent, and it wanted to spread. The decision came from higher up. Seal it, burn the buildings, pour concrete, bury the truth. The official story was written before the flames were even lit. 43 deaths from accidental fire. Case closed. The families of the dead received generous settlements with non-disclosure agreements attached. Robert told me the thing came from deep underground, from caves or voids in the permafrost that connected to something ancient. The commune had been unlucky enough to build directly above an access point, and their activities, Their dancing and music and gatherings had vibrated down through the earth like a dinner bell. The thing had been patient, working its way up through soil and rock, until it finally reached the surface and began calling to the people above. The victims had not died in the fire. They were already dead when the military arrived, transformed into hollow vessels compelled to dig deeper, to open more access points, to let more of the thing through. The fire was necessary to destroy the biological matter before it could spread. I asked Robert if he thought the seal would hold. His napkin tore in his shaking hands. He said they check it 4 times a year, test the concrete, monitor for vibrations. So far, it has held. But the thing beneath is patient. It waited millions of years before finding the commune. It can wait a few more decades for the concrete to crack, for the seal to weaken, for the next group of unsuspecting people to wander too close. I left Palmer the next morning, driving south toward Anchorage faster than I should have. But 20 miles out, I pulled over and vomited on the roadside, overwhelmed by what I had learned. 43 people had died horrible deaths, and their families never knew the truth. The government had decided that keeping the secret was more important than justice or closure or warning people about what lay beneath that innocent valley. Back home in Seattle, I tried to write the article, typed and deleted 1,000 words over 2 weeks. Because who would believe it? Without the classified documents, without testimony from officials who would deny everything, I had nothing but photographs and the word of a frightened old man. The story would destroy my credibility. But more than that, I began to understand the cover-up differently. Some truths are too dangerous to reveal. If people knew that something alien and hostile lived beneath the Palmer Valley, if they knew it was sealed but not destroyed, the panic would be catastrophic. Worse, someone might decide to investigate, to excavate, to break the seal and release what the government had sacrificed 43 lives to contain. The anonymous sender was right. They are still there, still contained, and that seal represents the only thing standing between normal life and something that should never have been disturbed. I burned the documents, deleted the photographs, destroyed every trace of the Palmer Colony massacre from my files. I am writing this now as a warning that I will never publish, a confession that exists only to organize my own thoughts and fears. If you ever find yourself near Palmer, Alaska, driving through that beautiful valley beneath the mountains, do not go looking for old commune sites. Do not investigate fenced areas in the woods. Do not ask questions about fires in the 70s or why certain areas remain posted with fresh warning signs. Because some secrets are kept not to protect the guilty but to protect everyone. The thing beneath the Palmer Colony site is sealed but not dead. It waits in the darkness under tons of concrete, patient and aware, hoping for the seal to fail or for curious people to break it open. I still wake up some nights hearing that thrumming sound Robert described, feeling it vibrate through my mattress and into my bones. My rational mind knows it is impossible, that I am hundreds of miles away, that the seal is holding. But another part of me, the part that saw those claw marks and stood above that massive concrete plug, knows that distance means nothing to something that can reach through earth and stone directly into human minds. The Palmer Colony massacre never happened. 43 people died in an accidental fire. The land was sealed for safety. These are the official facts, and they must remain the only facts. Because if the truth came out, if people knew what was buried there and started asking why we have not destroyed it, they would learn the terrifying answer: we tried. We tried every method available in 1976, and nothing worked. The only option was containment. So the concrete plug sits in that clearing, inspected and reinforced, holding back something that civilization is not ready to face. And I will never write this story. I will never reveal what I learned. But I needed to put it somewhere, needed to write it down once before I try to forget. Consider this a message in a bottle, a warning from someone who looked too closely at a covered-up tragedy and learned that some horrors are real, that governments do hide the truth, and that beneath the peaceful surface of ordinary places, nightmares wait. Story 8. Bone radio of Dillingham. The radio in my truck started reading names of dead people at exactly 3:17 a.m. And mine was the last one it spoke. My name is Robert Hayes, and I am a telecommunications investigator for the Federal Communications Commission. I spent 15 years tracking down pirate radio stations, illegal broadcasts, and signal interference across the country. I thought I had seen everything until I got assigned to investigate a mysterious transmission coming from somewhere near Dillingham, Alaska. What I discovered in that frozen wasteland changed everything I believed about reality, technology, and the terrifying thin line between the living and the dead. The complaint came through standard channels. Local residents reported a strange broadcast on multiple frequencies, appearing and disappearing without pattern. The transmission consisted of a monotone voice reading names, just names, one after another in an endless loop. No music, no commentary, no explanation. Just names spoken in that flat, emotionless tone that made your skin crawl even through the static. The locals called it the bone radio. Nobody knew why. I arrived in Dillingham on a gray November morning when the sun barely cleared the horizon before starting its descent again. The town sits on the edge of Bristol Bay, a fishing community of maybe 2,000 people, surrounded by endless tundra that stretches to the horizon in every direction. The kind of place where isolation is not just a feeling but a physical reality, where help is hours away and winter darkness lasts for months. The chief of the local volunteer fire department, a weathered man named Tom who had lived in Dillingham his entire life, met me at the tiny airport. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, a haunted expression that I had learned to recognize in people who had experienced something beyond normal comprehension. He drove me to the fire station and played me a recording of the broadcast. The moment the audio started, I felt a chill race down my spine. The voice was wrong in ways I could not immediately articulate. Flat and mechanical, yes, but also somehow organic, as if a person was reading the names but had forgotten how to sound human. The cadence was off, the pronunciation slightly twisted, each name delivered with the same disturbing lack of emotion. What made it truly horrifying was that Tom recognized some of the names. Missing persons from the area going back decades. Hunters who never returned from the tundra. Fishermen lost at sea. A teenager who disappeared after a party in 1994. The broadcast was reading names of the dead and vanished, cataloging them with that terrible mechanical precision. I spent the first 3 days trying to triangulate the signal source using standard radio direction finding equipment. The transmission hopped frequencies randomly, appearing on AM, FM, shortwave, even unusual bands that required specialized receivers. It broadcast for exactly 17 minutes at irregular intervals, always between midnight and 4 a.m., always reading the same list of names in the same order. The signal originated somewhere on the tundra, roughly 30 miles northeast of town. An area of absolute nothing, just frozen ground and stunted vegetation and the kind of emptiness that makes you understand how small and insignificant humans really are. On the fourth night, I went out to search for the source. Tom tried to stop me, warning that people who went looking for the bone radio sometimes did not come back. But I was confident in my equipment, my experience, my rational understanding of how radio transmission worked. Signals had sources. Sources could be found and shut down. This was just another illegal broadcast, probably some disturbed person with a transmitter and too much time alone in the wilderness. I was wrong about everything. The drive across the tundra was unsettling even before the real horror began. My truck bounced over frozen ground, headlights cutting weak beams through darkness so complete it felt solid. No trees, no landmarks, just endless flat nothing stretching in every direction. The only sound was the engine and the whisper of wind across the barren landscape. I had driven for maybe 90 minutes when my direction-finding equipment started going crazy. The signal was close, very close, coming from just ahead. I stopped the truck and stepped out into the freezing darkness. The cold was immediate and brutal, the kind of cold that makes you question whether humans should exist in such places. My breath crystallized instantly, hanging in clouds that reflected my flashlight beam with an eerie luminescence. The wind carried sounds that might have been natural but sounded almost like whispers, like voices speaking just below the threshold of comprehension. That is when I saw the shack. It materialized from the darkness like something from a nightmare, a crude structure made of weathered wood and rusted metal, sitting alone in the middle of absolute nowhere. No road led to it, no other buildings within miles. Just this single shack, existing impossibly in the middle of the frozen tundra. My equipment confirmed this was the source. The signal was coming from inside that disturbing little building. I approached slowly, every survival instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave. The shack had no windows, just a single door hanging crooked on broken hinges. A faint glow leaked through gaps in the walls, flickering and uncertain, not like electric light but more organic, more alive. I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Death and decay and something else. Something chemical and wrong. My flashlight beam swept across the interior, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. Bones, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, covering every surface, stacked in corners, hanging from the ceiling on fishing line, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. Human bones, I was certain, femurs and ribs and skulls with empty eye sockets that seemed to track my movement. And in the center of the shack, sitting on a crude wooden table, was the radio. Not a modern transmitter, not even old commercial equipment. This was something else entirely. A bizarre construction of vacuum tubes and copper wire and components I could not identify, all wired together in a configuration that made no technical sense. And woven throughout the machinery, integrated into the circuits themselves, were more bones. Small ones, finger bones maybe, connected to the electronics in ways that suggested they were not decoration but actual functioning components. The radio was on. Its single amber tube glowed with that sickly light I had seen from outside. And from a speaker made from what looked like a human skull, the voice emerged. Reading names, I stood frozen, listening to that flat monotone catalog, the missing and dead. Then, as I watched in horror, the radio seemed to sense my presence. The voice stopped mid-name. Silence stretched for several long seconds, broken only by the sound of my own terrified breathing. Then it spoke a new name. My name, Robert Hayes, my full name, pronounced with that same disturbing lack of emotion, delivered with the mechanical precision of an announcement of death. I ran. Pure panic took over as I sprinted from that terrible shack, stumbling across frozen ground, my breath coming in gasps that burned my lungs. Behind me, I could hear the radio continuing its broadcast, repeating my name over and over, adding it to the list of the missing and doomed. I made it back to my truck and drove toward town at reckless speed, tires skidding on ice, my hands shaking so badly I could barely control the wheel. The fear was overwhelming, a terror so profound it bypassed rational thought and struck directly at the primitive core of the brain. But the radio followed me. Every frequency I tried on my truck radio picked up the same broadcast. That voice, still reading names, still including mine in the terrible catalog. It was not confined to that shack anymore. It was everywhere, in every receiver, broadcasting from some impossible source that existed beyond normal electromagnetic reality. I made it back to Dillingham just before dawn. Tom took one look at me and knew I had found it. He poured coffee with shaking hands and told me the rest of the story. The shack had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Local legends claimed it was built by a prospector who went insane during the gold rush, a man obsessed with speaking to the dead. He supposedly collected bones from graves and burial sites across Alaska, convinced he could use them to create a device that would let him communicate with those who had passed beyond. The prospector disappeared in 1923, but his radio kept broadcasting, and everyone who found it, everyone who heard it speak their name, vanished within a week. Disappeared into the tundra without a trace, never to be seen again. I tried to leave Alaska that very day, but the flights were grounded by weather, and something deeper kept me trapped. The fear had transformed into something else, an obsession, a terrible need to understand what I had witnessed, to find some rational explanation for technology that could not exist and broadcasts that defied physics. I spent the next 2 days researching the history, digging through old records and forgotten archives. I found references to the prospector, a man named Silas Crane who had indeed gone missing in the 1920s. But I also found something else. Reports of similar devices across Alaska, crude radios built from bones and old technology, all broadcasting names, all claiming victims. Someone, or something, was building a network, using the bones of the dead to create transmitters that existed partially in our world and partially somewhere else. A bone radio network that cataloged the missing and called out to the living, drawing them into whatever terrible fate awaited those who heard their names spoken. On the third night, the broadcast changed. My name was no longer at the end of the list. It had moved up, appearing more frequently, repeated with increasing urgency. And between the names, I started hearing other sounds, whispers in languages I did not recognize, static that resolved into patterns that sounded almost like screaming, and underneath it all, a low-frequency drone that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The radio was not just reading names. It was calling, summoning, pulling those it marked towards some destination I could not comprehend but felt with absolute certainty. Tom found me in my motel room on the fourth morning, staring at a radio that should have been off but was broadcasting anyway. He looked at me with those haunted eyes and asked if I felt it. The pull, the terrible magnetic attraction toward the tundra, toward that shack, toward whatever waited in the darkness beyond rational understanding. I did feel it, a compulsion growing stronger by the hour, an irrational need to return to that terrible place, to stand before that bone radio and let it complete whatever process it had started when it spoke my name. Tom told me there was only one way to break free. I had to destroy the radio. Go back to the shack, smash the device, scatter the bones, break the circuit that connected the living world to whatever existed beyond. Others had tried and failed. Most never made it back. But it was the only chance. I drove out to the tundra one final time as the sunset and darkness claimed the landscape. The shack was exactly as I had left it, that sickly amber glow leaking through the walls, the whisper of the wind carrying sounds that were definitely not natural. Inside, the bone radio waited. It had grown somehow, new components added, more bones integrated into its impossible circuitry. The amber tube pulsed like a heartbeat, and the voice that emerged from the skull speaker was louder now, more insistent. It was reading my name continuously, a chant, a summons, a claim of ownership. I raised the sledgehammer I had brought and swung at the radio with all my strength. The impact sent sparks flying and shattered vacuum tubes, but the device did not die. If anything, it grew more intense. The voice rising to a shriek, the amber light blazing with terrible brightness. I smashed it again and again, destroying components, breaking bones, tearing apart the unholy construction. And with each impact, I felt something tear inside me, as if part of my own essence was wired into that terrible machine. The final blow shattered the skull speaker, and the voice cut off mid-syllable. The amber light died. Silence crashed down like a physical weight. I stood in the darkness, breathing hard, surrounded by the wreckage of something that should never have existed. And in that moment of triumph, I heard it, a new sound, not from the destroyed radio, but from the bones themselves. A clicking, a rattling, a sound of movement. The bones were reassembling. I fled the shack as the components began moving on their own, drawn together by forces beyond physics, rebuilding the radio through some terrible persistence that refused to acknowledge destruction. Behind me, I heard the amber tube reignite, heard the voice resume its broadcast, heard it speak my name with what almost sounded like anger. I drove away and did not look back. I caught the first flight out of Alaska and never returned. That was 8 months ago. The broadcast still finds me. Every radio I own, every device capable of receiving signals, picks it up occasionally. That flat voice, reading names, always including mine somewhere in the catalog. The pull has faded but never completely disappeared. Some nights, I wake up with the overwhelming urge to drive north, to return to that frozen tundra, to stand before the bone radio and let it complete its claim. I know now what the broadcast really is. Not a catalog of the missing. An invitation, a calling. The bones are collecting us, one by one, building something vast and terrible from the remains of the lost. And everyone whose name gets spoken becomes part of it, part of a network that spreads across Alaska like a web, each node another bone radio, each transmission another claim on the living. My name is Robert Hayes, and someday soon, when the pull becomes too strong to resist, I will return to Dillingham. I will drive out to that shack on the tundra, and I will become part of the broadcast. Another voice in the chorus, another name in the terrible catalog. The bone radio is always listening, and once it speaks your name, it never lets you go. Story 9. Kodiak Other. I saw myself walk into Sal's Harbor Bar 3 days before I died. Not a reflection, not a dream, my exact double, wearing the same weathered jacket I owned, the same boots with the same torn laces, the same scar across my left knuckle from a fishing line accident 10 years ago. He ordered a drink I had never tasted, and when he turned to look at me across the crowded bar, his eyes were completely black. Not dark, black, like staring into an absolute void where eyes should exist. My name is Thomas, and I am a commercial fisherman based out of Kodiak, Alaska. I've worked these waters for 23 years. I've survived storms that would have killed weaker men. I've pulled bodies out of the ocean, recovered wreckage, witnessed things in the darkness that no one should ever see. But nothing prepared me for the terrifying, creepy moment when I watched my own doppelganger materialize in a crowded bar, and I understood with absolute certainty that I was about to die. The locals in Kodiak knew about the other fishermen. Every old-timer had a story. A fisherman would see himself somewhere, anywhere, and 3 days later, his boat would be found empty, drifting in the Alaskan waters with no sign of struggle. Or he would simply vanish. Sometimes his body would wash ashore weeks later, bloated and unrecognizable. Sometimes he would never be found at all, just another fisherman lost to the sea. I had always thought it was nonsense. A creepy legend that fishing communities told themselves to rationalize the inherent danger of their profession. Men died at sea. It happened. It didn't require supernatural explanation. But I had been dismissive of something I didn't understand. And now, staring across that bar at my perfect duplicate, I understood that the legend was absolutely real. The other didn't acknowledge me beyond that initial stare. He finished his drink with movements that were almost right, almost natural, but subtly wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. His shoulders moved too smoothly. His breathing seemed rhythmic in a way that human breathing shouldn't be. When he reached for his glass, his fingers bent at angles that looked physically impossible. Then he stood up and walked out of the bar. I followed him immediately, pushing through the crowd, desperate to understand what I had just witnessed. But when I got outside into the Kodiak night, he was gone. Completely vanished, as if he had never existed at all. The street was empty. The harbor beyond was dark and silent except for the gentle lapping of water against the docks. I told myself I had imagined it. Stress, exhaustion, too much whiskey. That's what I told myself, even though I knew it was a lie. I had seen my double. I had looked into those black, void-like eyes, and I had felt the creepy, unsettling certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with the universe. That night, I didn't go home. I drove out to my boat, the Molly Jane, a 40-foot commercial fishing vessel that had been my second home for more than 2 decades. I climbed aboard, locked myself in the cabin, and tried to make sense of what was happening. The terrifying realization was settling in. If the legend was true, I had 72 hours left to live. The first day passed in a state of numb paranoia. I checked the weather reports obsessively. I inspected every inch of my boat for mechanical problems. I couldn't eat. I barely slept. Every shadow seemed to contain threat. Every unusual sound made my heart skip. The eerie, unsettling feeling that something was watching me never left. Not for a single moment. The second day, I saw the other again. This time, he was standing on the dock outside my boat, looking down at the water with an expression that might have been curiosity or hunger or something far more disturbing. When I emerged from my cabin, he turned to look at me. His head rotated with an unnatural, jerky motion that made my stomach turn. His black eyes fixed on mine, and I could see something moving inside them, something alive and ancient and absolutely malevolent. I ran. I jumped off my boat and fled down the dock, my boots echoing against the wooden planks. When I turned to look back, the other was gone, but I could feel him. I could sense his presence moving through the harbor, through the town, drawing closer with each passing hour. The fear was becoming suffocating, the paranoia all-consuming. I went to the police station. Officer Martinez listened to my story with the kind of patient skepticism that cops develop after years of dealing with desperate, frightened people. He didn't believe me, but he took my statement. He even drove me around town to check on my safety, but there was nothing to check. No crime, no actual threat he could document or arrest. When we got back to the station, Martinez told me about the fishermen. In the last 15 years, there had been 8 disappearances of experienced commercial fishermen from Kodiak. 8 men, all with families, all with documented sightings of themselves in the weeks before they vanished. 8 men who had seen the other fishermen and subsequently disappeared into the dark Alaskan waters. The official explanations ranged from suicide to equipment failure to maritime accidents. But the unofficial explanation, the one that the fishermen themselves knew and accepted with grim fatalism, was that the other came for those whose time was ending. It was a harbinger, a warning, a manifestation of something that existed in the spaces between worlds, something that fed on the fear and desperation of doomed men. Martinez offered to let me stay at the station, to provide what protection he could. I refused. I knew it wouldn't matter. If the other wanted me, locked doors and human witnesses wouldn't stop it. The only real question was when, and I had a feeling I already knew the answer. The third day arrived with a gray, oppressive sky. The harbor was shrouded in fog, the visibility reduced to maybe 50 feet. I had planned to take the Molly Jane out, to get away from town, to see if distance would matter. But when I arrived at the dock, I found the other standing at the helm of my boat. He was waiting for me, patient and still and absolutely terrifying. His black eyes tracked my approach, and I realized that running was no longer an option. This was the moment. This was when the legend reached its horrifying, inevitable conclusion. I climbed aboard my own boat, and my doppelganger didn't move. He simply stood there, watching me with an expression that suggested he had been expecting this meeting for much longer than 3 days. Maybe he had been expecting it forever. Maybe every fisherman he had claimed had led him to this moment. I opened my mouth to speak, but the other raised one hand with that same unnatural, jerky motion. When I looked down, I realized my hand was rising in the exact same way. I wasn't controlling my arm anymore. The movements were happening independently, as if I was watching someone else manipulate my own body from the outside. The terror that seized me at that moment was unlike anything I had experienced before. I was losing control. The other wasn't standing across from me anymore. The other was inside me, wearing my skin, using my limbs, taking control of my consciousness piece by piece. The black void that filled where his eyes should be was expanding, spreading through my vision, consuming my awareness. The last coherent thought I had was a horrible understanding. The other wasn't the doppelganger. It wasn't the separate entity that came to claim doomed fishermen. It was a parasite, something that attached itself to men and slowly consumed them, wearing their identities while devouring their humanity from the inside out. The fishermen didn't die in dramatic accidents. They were replaced. They became the other, and then the other used their form and their knowledge to find the next victim. I tried to scream, but my mouth wasn't responding. My body was walking toward the helm of the Molly Jane, preparing to set sail. I could feel myself sinking deeper into the darkness, becoming a passenger in my own existence, watching from somewhere deep inside as the other took complete control. The harbor disappeared into fog. The Molly Jane began moving through dark waters. I was aware of my hands working the controls, of the engine rumbling to life, of the boat pushing out into the Alaskan Sea. But it wasn't me doing any of it. It was the other, and I was dying bit by bit. Consciousness fading, identity dissolving into nothing. The most horrifying part was the awareness. Even as I was being consumed, even as my humanity was being stripped away, I remained conscious enough to understand what was happening. I was becoming the void. I was becoming the thing with black eyes that walked into bars and stood on docks. I was becoming the harbinger of doom that would soon hunt another fisherman, another unsuspecting man who would see his own double and feel the creepy, unsettling certainty that death was coming for him. 3 days. That's how long the legend said you had after seeing the other. But the legend didn't explain what happened during those 3 days. It didn't mention the slow consumption, the gradual replacement, the horrifying process of being erased and transformed into something that wore your face but contained something ancient and hungry and absolutely, terrifyingly evil. The Molly Jane was found 3 weeks later, drifting empty in the waters off Kodiak. The search and rescue team found no sign of struggle, no blood, no wreckage. Just an empty boat and the unsettling question of what had happened to Thomas Crawford. The official report concluded maritime accident, equipment failure, accidental fall overboard. Another fisherman lost to the unpredictable Alaskan Sea. But the other fishermen in Kodiak knew the truth. They whispered about it in the bars and the harbors, speaking in low voices about the legend of the other fishermen, about the 3-day warning, about the terrifying, eerie awareness that one of them might see his double at any moment and know that the end was coming. What they didn't know is that I was still out there, still moving through the waters off Kodiak, still hunting. The other doesn't kill fishermen. It replaces them. It wears their skins and takes their places, and then it uses their knowledge of the sea, their connections to the fishing community, their trusted status among the crew, to find the next one. I've already claimed 2 more men since then, both experienced fishermen, both terrified and confused about why they were seeing themselves walking through the town. Both of them are becoming like me now, consciousness fading, humanity dissolving, void expanding where their identities used to be. Soon, there will be enough of us. We stop hunting individually, and we begin working together. We infiltrate the fishing boats and the harbor bars and the small Alaskan communities. We spread like a plague, replacing the living with copies of ourselves, until the entire fishing fleet belongs to us. The legend calls it the other fishermen, but there won't be just one of us much longer. There will be dozens, maybe hundreds, all of us wearing stolen faces, all of us with black void eyes, all of us spreading the creepy, terrifying knowledge that death is coming. That replacement is inevitable, that humanity in Kodiak is reaching its final days. The water is patient, the sea is hungry, and the other fisherman is always looking for the next reflection to steal, the next consciousness to consume. The next fisherman who will walk into a bar and see himself staring back with eyes full of absolute darkness. I am still here, in the Molly Jane, moving through the fog, waiting for the right moment to climb ashore and begin the hunt again. The legend says you have 3 days after seeing the other fisherman. But that is not how much time you really have. You always had 3 days. You just didn't, the clock was running. Story 10. Kenai Doppelganger Disease. I watched myself walk into the forest 3 days ago, and I have been slowly disappearing ever since. My name is David Brennan, and I moved to Kenai, Alaska in March of last year to take over my uncle's fishing supply business after he passed away. The town sits on the Kenai Peninsula, a quiet community of about 7,000 people surrounded by wilderness and the frigid waters of Cook Inlet. I thought I was starting a simple life, escaping the chaos of Los Angeles, building something solid and real. Instead, I stumbled into a nightmare that has been quietly claiming people for decades, a horrifying phenomenon that the town refuses to acknowledge but can never forget. My uncle left me more than just a business. He left me a journal, hidden in the back of his desk, filled with entries that made no sense until it was too late. The final entry, dated 2 weeks before his death, simply read, "I saw myself today at the harbor. Now I understand why they vanish. I am not sure how much longer I have." I dismissed it as the confused writings of a sick man. My uncle had cancer, the doctor said. He was on heavy pain medication. The journal was just the rambling of someone facing mortality, seeing doubles, losing touch with reality in those final days. I was wrong about everything. The first month in Kenai passed normally. I learned the business, met the locals, adjusted to the long winter darkness and the eerie silence that settles over small Alaskan towns when the tourists leave. The people were friendly but reserved, carrying themselves with a wariness I could not quite identify. They watched each other carefully, I noticed, eyes always scanning faces in the grocery store, at the post office, on the street, as if they were constantly verifying something. I asked the woman who ran the local diner about it. She was in her 60s, had lived in Kenai her entire life, knew everyone and everything. When I mentioned how people seemed nervous, always looking around, her face went pale and she changed the subject so quickly I knew I had touched something forbidden. That night, I found more journals. My uncle had kept them for years, dozens of notebooks hidden in various places around his house. I started reading from the earliest one, dated 1983, and discovered the true history of Kenai. A history of disappearances, of strange sightings, of a phenomenon the town called the Doppelganger Disease. It started in the summer of 1983. A fisherman named Carl Jensen was walking home from the harbor when he saw himself coming from the opposite direction. Not someone who looked like himself. Exact duplicate. Same clothes, same walk, same scar on his cheek from a childhood accident. The two versions of Carl Jensen locked eyes for a moment, and my uncle wrote that Carl described it as the most terrifying experience of his life, like staring into a mirror that showed something it should not. Carl ran home and did not leave his house for 3 days. When he finally emerged, neighbors said he seemed different, quieter, more hesitant, like he was not quite sure of himself anymore. 2 weeks later, Carl Jensen vanished, left his house one morning to check his boat and never came back. They found his truck at the harbor, keys in the ignition, wallet on the seat. But Carl was gone. Over the next 6 months, 11 more people reported seeing their doubles. And all 11 vanished within days or weeks of the sighting. Some left without a trace. Others were found in the wilderness, but there was something wrong with the bodies. My uncle's journal was vague about the details, but he wrote that they were incomplete somehow, as if parts of them had already started to disappear before death. The phenomenon stopped as suddenly as it started. No more sightings, no more disappearances. The town collectively decided to forget, to never speak of it again, to pretend those 11 people had simply moved away or died in normal accidents. But my uncle kept watching, kept noting strange behaviors, kept documenting the way certain people seemed to flicker sometimes, their features becoming uncertain, as if they were not quite solid. And then, in 2004, it happened again. 3 people over 6 months. Then it stopped. In 2015, 5 people. Each outbreak separated by years of silence, each claiming a handful of victims before going dormant again. I sat in my uncle's house reading these journals until dawn, my coffee going cold, my hands shaking. This could not be real. Mass hysteria maybe, shared delusion in an isolated community. But the detail in my uncle, his writing, the careful documentation, the names and dates and descriptions, all of it felt too concrete to dismiss. I decided to investigate, to talk to people who had been in Kenai during the 1983 outbreak. Most refused to speak with me. A few got angry, told me to leave the past alone, warned me that asking questions was dangerous. But eventually, I found someone willing to talk. His name was Robert, a man in his 70s who had been Carl Jensen, his best friend. We met at a coffee shop on the edge of town, and he looked around nervously the entire time, as if afraid of being seen with me. He confirmed everything in my uncle, his journal, and added details that made my blood run cold. The doppelgangers were not just visual copies. They knew things only the original person could know. Memories, secrets, private thoughts. Several people had tried to confront their doubles, thinking maybe it was an elaborate prank or a case of mistaken identity. But every encounter ended with the horrifying realization that they were facing something that was them in every possible way. Something that should not exist but did. Robert told me about seeing Carl 3 days after his disappearance. Carl was standing at the end of a dock, staring out at the water. Robert called to him, relieved to have found his friend. Carl turned around, and Robert said that for just a moment, he could see through him. Like Carl was becoming transparent, fading away into nothing. Then Carl smiled, walked to the edge of the dock, and stepped off into the water. But there was no splash. Carl just vanished mid-step, as if he had walked through a door that only he could see. I left that meeting shaking, my mind refusing to accept what I had heard. But that night, I dreamed of my uncle. He stood in my bedroom doorway, looking exactly as he had in the last weeks before his death, gaunt and pale. He did not speak. He just pointed behind me, toward the window. I turned in the dream and saw myself standing outside, looking in, my face pressed against the glass. I woke up screaming. The next day, I saw it, my double. I was loading supplies into my truck behind the shop when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. I turned and there I was, standing at the tree line about 50 yards away. Same height, same build, same jacket I had bought 2 weeks earlier. The other me was just standing there, watching. Every rational part of my brain insisted this was impossible. A trick of light, someone who happened to look like me. Stress-induced hallucination. But deep in my gut, in that primitive part of the brain that knows danger instinctively, I understood the truth. I was seeing my doppelganger. And according to the pattern my uncle had documented, I now had days or weeks before I vanished. The double did not move, did not wave or call out, just stood there with an expression I could not read from that distance. Then, slowly, deliberately, it turned and walked into the forest. I watched myself disappear between the trees, moving with my own gait, my own mannerisms, until the shadows swallowed the image completely. I spent the rest of that day in a state of shock, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold a coffee cup. I called the police, tried to report what I had seen, but the dispatcher, his tone changed the moment I mentioned a double. She became cold, professional, told me someone would look into it and then clearly had no intention of following up. That night, I barricaded myself in my uncle's house and read every journal again, searching for anything that might explain how to survive this. Most of the entries were just observations, documentation of disappearances, but buried in the journals from 2004, I found something else. A theory. My uncle believed the doppelgangers were not copies but replacements. Something was taking people and leaving these doubles behind as placeholders, as camouflage. The doubles would integrate into the victim, his life, becoming them so completely that no one noticed the switch. But occasionally, the process failed. The original person would see their replacement before the transfer was complete, before they fully vanished. And in those cases, both versions would exist temporarily in a state of quantum uncertainty, each one real and unreal simultaneously, until the universe corrected the paradox by erasing one. Usually, it erased the original. My uncle had included newspaper clippings with the journals. I had not paid much attention to them before, but now I read each one carefully. Articles about people who died in strange accidents or disappeared completely. But in the photographs accompanying some of these articles, I saw it. The people looked slightly wrong, features just a bit off, like a photograph that was almost in focus but not quite. And in their eyes, there was something missing, some spark of genuine humanity replaced with perfect imitation. The next morning, I saw my double again. This time it was closer, standing across the street from the shop. Same clothes again, same everything. We made eye contact, and I felt a sensation like falling, like the ground disappearing beneath my feet. The world seemed to flicker, reality becoming uncertain, and for a terrifying moment I was not sure which one of us was real. I ran inside and locked the door. Through the window, I watched my double stand there for another 5 minutes before turning and walking away with my exact stride, my exact posture. It was heading toward the center of town, toward places I frequented, toward my life. Over the next 2 days, people started treating me differently. Customers at the shop would look at me strangely, as if they were seeing me but not quite recognizing me. A woman I had been dating called and said I seemed different lately. Distant, not quite myself. She asked if everything was okay, and I could hear the confusion in her voice, as if she was talking to someone she thought she knew but did not quite remember. I realized what was happening. My double was replacing me, interacting with people, building relationships, becoming me in the eyes of everyone I knew. And as it became more real, I was becoming less real. I could feel it happening, a strange lightness in my limbs, a disconnection from physical sensation, as if my body was slowly becoming insubstantial. I started avoiding mirrors because what I saw was terrifying. My reflection was fading, not dramatically, not obviously, but gradually becoming less solid, less defined. Like a photograph left in the sun, slowly bleaching away into nothing. Desperate, I drove to Robert's house. He took one look at me and his face went white. He could see it too, the fading, the disappearing. He told me there was nothing I could do, that once the process started, it always finished the same way. The original vanished, the double remained, and everyone forgot there had ever been two. But he also told me something my uncle had never written down. A few people had tried to fight it, to confront their doubles directly, to force some kind of resolution. Most had simply accelerated their own disappearance, but one person, a woman in 1983, had survived. She tracked her double down and confronted it at the exact location of her first sighting. And somehow, in that confrontation, the double had dissolved and she had remained. Robert did not know why it worked for her and not others. He did not know the mechanism, but it was the only hope I had. I went back to the spot behind my shop where I had first seen my double. I waited there as the sun set and darkness settled over Kenai. The temperature dropped, frost forming on the ground, my breath fogging in the cold air. And at precisely the same time as that first sighting, my double emerged from the forest. We stood facing each other, two identical versions of the same person, separated by maybe 20 feet. I could see it clearly now, see that it was not quite right. The movements were too smooth, too practiced. The expression was perfect but somehow empty, like a mask that had learned to mimic emotion without understanding it. The double spoke. It was the first time I had heard it make a sound, and hearing my own voice coming from something that was not me sent waves of horror through my entire body. It said that I did not need to fight this, that the process was natural, that I would not even remember disappearing. It would take over my life seamlessly, and no one would know the difference. It would be me in every way that mattered. But I would be gone. I ran at it, pure instinct, pure desperation. The moment I made contact, the world exploded into chaos. Reality seemed to fracture, splitting into multiple overlapping versions of the same moment. I saw myself from a dozen angles simultaneously, felt my consciousness stretching across multiple bodies, experienced the horrifying sensation of being in two places at once while also being nowhere at all. The double fought back, not physically, but metaphysically, trying to push me out of existence, to claim sole ownership of being David Brennan. I could feel myself slipping, fading, my memories becoming uncertain, my sense of self dissolving like sugar in water. In that moment of supreme terror, I understood what my uncle had figured out too late. The doppelgangers were not from somewhere else. They were us, our own reflection in some quantum mirror, another version from another possibility, trying to collapse the waveform in their favor. We were both real, but reality could only support one. I focused everything on a single memory. My mother's face. A specific moment when I was 8 years old and she had held me after a nightmare, telling me I was real, I was here, I was her son. I held on to that memory with everything I had, using it as an anchor to this reality, to this version of David Brennan. The double screamed, not with sound, but with existence itself, a shriek of reality being rewritten. Then it was gone. Not fading, not running, just erased, as if it had never been. The fracturing sensation stopped, the world solidified, and I was alone behind my shop, collapsed on the cold ground, completely and undeniably singular. I spent the next 2 days barely able to move, my entire body aching as if I had fought a physical battle. But I was solid again. My reflection showed a normal, complete image. People recognized me normally. The fading had stopped, but the horror has not ended. Because now I understand what my uncle understood. The doubles do not just vanish when the original survives. They go somewhere. They exist somewhere. And I can feel it watching me now. That other version, the one I erased from this reality. It is waiting in whatever space exists between possibilities, and it is angry. Sometimes, in my peripheral vision, I see it, standing at the edge of the forest, watching from across the street, looking out from crowds with my face wearing an expression of patient hatred. It cannot manifest fully anymore, but it has not given up. It is just waiting for me to weaken, to doubt, to forget that moment of absolute certainty that kept me real. My uncle's final journal entry makes sense now. He saw his double. He fought it. He won, temporarily. But the strain of maintaining that certainty, of staying completely real, eventually killed him. The cancer was just the physical manifestation of the metaphysical battle he was losing. And I fear I am losing it too. Each day it gets harder to remember that core memory, that anchor. My mother has been dead for 10 years, and the memory is fading naturally, the edge is becoming uncertain. And as it fades, I feel my double getting stronger, pressing closer to this reality, preparing to try again. The doppelganger disease never really stopped in Kenai. It is always here, always waiting. Some of the people walking these streets are not the originals anymore. They are the doubles who won, the replacements who claimed the lives they wanted. And the originals are gone, erased, existing only in some quantum limbo between what is and what might have been. I am still here, still real, still David Brennan. But every morning when I look in the mirror, I have to spend a moment convincing myself that the reflection is really me and not the thing pretending to be me. And someday, I fear I will look in that mirror and not be able to tell the difference anymore. 10 towns, 10 horrors, 10 warnings that nobody heeded. But I promised you something at the beginning, the pattern that connects them all. The warning sign that could save your life. Here it is. Every single story contains the same element. Seeing yourself when you shouldn't. Your reflection where no mirror exists. Your double walking toward you. Your face in someone else's body. This isn't coincidence. This is how it starts in every Alaskan small town where people vanish. The doppelganger. The echo. The other you. It appears in different forms. Chanting figures in caves. Ghost trains with passengers wearing your face. Skulls with glowing eyes that watch through you. Radios that speak your name before you die. But it is always the same core phenomenon. You, duplicated, watching yourself from the outside. And here is the terrifying scientific truth. Small Alaskan towns exist in what physicists call quantum isolation zones. The extreme darkness, the magnetic anomalies near the Arctic, the geological instability, all of it creates spaces where reality becomes thin, where other versions of you can bleed through, where the boundary between possible and impossible breaks down. The 72-hour rule is real. From the moment you see your double, you have 3 days before one of you stops existing. And it is almost never the double that disappears. I told you at the beginning that 3 people died in the past 6 months. Here is what I didn't tell you. All 3 contacted me after watching this exact content. All 3 reported seeing themselves after learning about the pattern. All 3 thought they were paranoid. All 3 are gone now. Their families asked me to include their names. Sarah Mitchell, Ketchikan, James Rodriguez, Bethel, Emily Chen, Palmer. They watched. They learned. They saw themselves. They didn't leave in time. The most disturbing part? Their bodies were never found. But security footage shows them walking into the wilderness. And in every frame, there are 2 of them. 2 versions walking side by side. And by the final frame, only one remains. Always the wrong one. If you haven to subscribe to Midnight Whispers stories, do it now. Next week, the Alaska Triangle explained why 16,000 people have vanished in this region, and the government document that reveals what is really taking them. Subscribers get 48-hour early access. Destroy that like button if these stories made your blood run cold. If you Now checking every reflection. If you afraid of meeting yourself, your likes push this warning to more people who need it. Drop a comment. Which Alaskan town story terrified you most? Have you ever seen your double? This is critical. Report it. Where you rewatching from and the current time did you catch that hidden phrase in story number 5? Most importantly, have you been to Alaska? What happened there? Share this video, but warn them first. Tell them to watch during daylight. Tell them that knowledge has consequences. Because viewers report changes after watching. Enhanced peripheral vision. The sensation of being followed. Faces in mirrors that daunt to match their movements. Smash that notification bell. Next episode covers the illusion chain phenomena. Entire islands where people see themselves and never come back. Makes these town stories seem tame. I need to tell you something personal before you go. 3 weeks ago, I saw myself. I was editing this video at 3 a.m. in my Seattle apartment, and I looked up to see myself standing in my doorway. Same clothes, same exhausted expression, but the eyes were wrong. Empty, like something had learned to wear my face but forgot to fill in the eyes. I ran, grabbed my keys and drove south until sunrise. I haven't been back to that apartment. My neighbor says someone is still living there. Someone who looks exactly like me, uses my name, pays my rent, but she says something is wrong with the eyes. I am telling you this because I understand now what the Alaskan town residents understand. This isn't just happening in Alaska. Alaska is where it is most concentrated, where the reality barriers are thinnest. But it is spreading. Seattle, Portland, Vancouver, anywhere with extreme isolation or geological anomalies. Anywhere the boundaries wear thin. The doubles are learning. They are getting better at mimicking us. Soon, they will be indistinguishable. And when that happens, you won. Do you know if you talking to your friend, your family member, or something wearing their face while the real person dissolves into quantum uncertainty? Check your loved ones' eyes. Real eyes have depth, complexity. The doubles' eyes are perfect but empty. Like HD screens displaying an image of eyes instead of actual biological organs seeing the world. I am uploading this from a motel outside Eugene, Oregon. I've been driving south for 3 weeks. But last night, I saw myself in the motel parking lot. Just standing there, watching my window. The doubles are following me. Or maybe the double and I don't know it anymore. Maybe the real me is gone and just the echo that thinks it's real. That is the true horror of Alaskan small towns. That is what the pattern reveals. Once you see yourself, you can never be certain which version you are. The original slowly fading, or the replacement convincing itself it was always real. Stay safe, stay alert, stay subscribed to Midnight Whispers stories. And if you see yourself, run. Dawn, to stop. Dawn, to investigate. Dawn, to try to understand. Just run, and dawn, to look back. Because the moment you acknowledge your double, the moment you make eye contact with the other you, the universe has to choose which version is real. And it never chooses the original. We're both real now.